I've resigned. I will not be pushed, filed, stamped, indexed, briefed, debriefed, or numbered.
Okay, we're talking today with Tom Theobald, and I heard a fantastic podcast out of Britain. The website is The Barefoot Beekeeper, and Tom was a guest on there, and that started up a whole new line of investigation that I never even knew about. Tom, you're out of Colorado. You are correct me if I'm wrong, a founding member of the Boulder County Beekeepers Association. Is that right?
Yes, I was one of the founders.
And how much experience beekeeping do you have?
Well, this will be year number 36.
Wow. My wife and I have just been talking about getting into beekeeping. We hope to do it by next spring. This year we had to settle for getting chickens.
Well, I have chickens too, so I understand.
Now, I had previously thought when I heard stories and kind of noticed myself about the strange disappearance of honeybees in our land, in I think every state now in North America. I heard stories about it, and I, out of ignorance, I just kind of chalked it up to, well, it's probably has to do with the GMOs. But when I heard you talk, you have a much more specific culprit for the dying off of our bees. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, we need to back up a little bit.
Got it.
It became a national news story in 2006 when a Pennsylvania beekeeper, David Hackenberg, reported the sudden disappearance of bees from a large number of colonies, something that would be unheard of in beekeeping. And it was shortly after that the term colony collapse disorder was created, and really all that does is that attempts to give us an umbrella term under which we can try to understand what was going on. So there's really no such thing as colony collapse disorder. It's used to describe a set of symptoms that we were seeing in the beekeeping world. And I've been seeing these much longer than 2006. I've been seeing these large losses. But if we back up about 4 years ago, I did a very careful post-mortem on the colonies that I had lost the previous winter. And what I could see from my examination of the colonies that hadn't made it was that sometime in the fall, and I estimated it was October, there had been a sudden contraction of the colony population and what we refer to as the brood nest. The brood nest is the brood in all stages, which would be egg, larva, and pupa, would cover several combs, several honeycombs, generally spherical in shape, and might be the size of a basketball in October. And what I could see in those colonies was that at some point that brood nest had contracted from basketball size down to grapefruit size. And that small a bunch of bees is sort of below the critical mass to survive the winter, and indeed most of those small clusters did not survive the winter. So that was my first concern, and obviously I was concerned about what was causing this sudden decline. And during that summer, I was also observing that I was seeing very few varroa mites, and varroa mites are a predatory, a parasitic mite that appeared in North America for the first time in about 1988, and have been one of the things that we've attributed these losses to, and certainly the mites have made inroads into the bee population. And I wasn't seeing many mites, and that puzzled me a little, but more importantly, from an economic standpoint, mite treatments are fairly expensive if you have a larger number of colonies. So I decided that since my colony numbers were down, my colony count was down, after the harvest in the fall, I was going to go through each colony frame by frame and only medicate those where I found mites. Now, normally a beekeeper wouldn't be doing this in the fall. We've worked with those colonies all summer, and we pretty much understand their condition. We know which ones are having problems and which ones seem to be doing fine. And we'll come along, we'll pop the cover, take a peek. If we see a good population of bees in the hive, we give them a heft from behind, and if they feel good and heavy, that's about the extent of our inspections in the fall. Well, what I found when I started going through the colonies after the harvest was, in the first bee yard that I went to, was colony after colony which had no brood at all. You know, just unheard of for that to occur in the natural order of things. It was a windy day, and I didn't really have a chance to go through those colonies in as much detail as I wanted to, so I came back about 3 days later when the weather was a little better, and I went through those colonies again, and what I found was that each of those colonies had a young, vigorous, apparently healthy, active queen, but, as I said, no brood in the colony. And I began to do a little research and searching, trying to figure out what might have caused that. And the trail led back to a systemic pesticide called clothianidin. Clothianidin is of the family of neonicotinoids, which are chlorinated nicotine compounds. And clothianidin was released to the market in 2003 and was used as a treatment on corn. What happens is the clothianidin, all of the neonicotinoids, are water-soluble, so they're taken up by the vascular system of the plant, and they're transported to all of the plant parts, including the pollen. And corn, although corn is wind-pollinated, because it's wind-pollinated, it has to produce billions and billions of pollen spores to assure that it gets pollinated. It doesn't require the bees, but the bees rely on pollen as their protein source to feed the larval stage of their young. The larvae grow over a period of 7 days, grow from a tiny little egg to a full-size larva, and that rapid growth requires a great deal of protein, and pollen is the protein source for a colony of bees. So what I was concluding, and understand this is my hypothesis, but this is based on a fair amount of scientific evidence in support of what I have concluded, and years of experience. What I think was occurring was that when the corn was tasseling, shedding pollen, the bees exploited that rich pollen source, and because it was in such abundance, they stored it as a surplus, put it away in the pantry, in other words. And one of the characteristics of a colony of bees is that they will take fresh pollen in preference to stored pollen. So as soon as the corn quits tasseling, then the bees go back to whatever the pollen of the day is. And that continues until about the third week in September, when the natural floral spectrum begins to shrink with the approaching season, where things are cycling down. It's at that point that the bees tap that stored pollen, and they begin to feed it to the brood. And it does exactly what the research would tell us it does, which is it disrupts the fertility of the queen and the viability of the brood. And we know that from studies that were done in France in the 1990s with another neonicotinoid called imidacloprid. And imidacloprid was the first neonicotinoid to come on the market, came out in 1994, and caused huge problems in France. And in 1999, I believe it was banned in France.
Wow.
And the research showed exactly what I've just said, that it disrupted the fertility of the queen and the viability of the brood. So what I believe was happening is that about the third week in September, the queen stopped laying or stopped laying viable brood. The larva that was being fed that contaminated pollen died. The brood cycle is about 3 weeks. It takes about 3 weeks to go from egg to emerging adult bee. So I was looking at this first bee yard the 8th of October, and if I back that off 3 weeks, then that takes me to about the second or third week in September. That was the beginning. So,
yeah.
Now, do you have any questions to this point? I can keep talking and I can keep telling this story, but if you have any questions, just interject.
It's my understanding from what I have read online that, all the neonicotinoids are toxic to bees, but clothianidin is especially toxic to honeybees. Is that right?
Clothianidin is one of the more toxic neonicotinoids. They're all toxic, but clothianidin is more toxic.
Now, France is not the only country that has banned this pesticide and others like it, right?
No, it's subsequently been banned in Germany, Slovenia, Italy, to one degree or another. The major bans have been on corn and sunflowers. They were the main culprits. What I found, I continued to investigate, and what I found was a series of EPA memoranda that documented the consideration of this product, and that in itself is a very interesting story. In February of 2003, Bayer had come to the EPA and requested the approval of clothianidin as a seed treatment on corn and canola. And at that point, the EPA scientists said there should be a complete life cycle study completed before this product is released to the market. And they said that because of their concerns about its safety to bees based upon the research that had been done in France. Well, that held for about 2 months, and the next memoranda was the EPA scientists used the term upon further consideration.
Yeah.
And what they agreed to was they agreed to a conditional registration. The condition being that the life cycle study be completed during the first growing season and be turned into the EPA by December of the following year. In itself, a very generous step, because we have here a product that had very serious questions surrounding it, and yet it was released to the market under a conditional registration. Now, that seems a little unwise, but on further investigation, what we found is that since 1997, 70% of the pesticides that have been released to the market have been released with conditional registrations, with questions of some concern. In the case of clothianidin, those questions were huge. It's like me saying to you, here, Gordon, drink this. We'll see what happens to you.
Yeah.
Okay? So the life cycle study was not completed the first year, and it was not completed the second year, and it was not completed the third year. It was not completed until August of 2006. And there were many people who were looking for the completion of this life cycle study. Despite the attention that had been directed toward it, the EPA failed to review that life cycle study for another 15 months. And when they did review it, they said right in the opening paragraph, this study is scientifically sound.
Mm-hmm.
All right?
Yeah.
Now, it was at about this time that the Natural Resources Defense Council began inquiring of the EPA as to the status of this study, to one degree because of the prompting by the beekeeping community, and we also were looking for it. So the NRDC asked the EPA where the study was. The EPA ignored them. The next step that the NRDC took was to file a Freedom of Information Act request, and the EPA let the time run out and didn't respond. So in August of 2008, the NRDC filed suit for this study. It was about that time, I didn't know what the NRDC was doing. We were sort of working independently of each other. It was at about that time that I discovered this missing study, as it had been referred to, on the Internet, just about the time that the NRDC filed suit. And it was within about a month after the suit was filed that, the EPA found it after all. Isn't that interesting? Well, you need to understand the study, and I wrote an article in Bee Culture magazine in July of last year where I outlined generally what I've been saying here, and I called into question the validity of this life cycle study. And here's how the life cycle study was pursued. It should have been done on corn. Corn is a rich for the bees. And in the United States, corn represented about 88 million acres. Canola, less than 1 million. And we had previous problems with contaminated corn pollen and another insecticide in the 1990s. And so it was clear that the corn pollen could be a vector for this kind of damage. Well, the EPA allowed Bayer to conduct the study on canola rather than corn, and allowed them to do it in Canada rather than in the United States. Previously, the EPA scientists had said if the studies are done, they should be done in the United States. And what the studies consisted of was 4 colonies of bees placed on 2.5 acres that had been planted with treated seed. And
so they're treating the seeds with this stuff.
Yes, and it becomes systemic to the plant. So they had 4 colonies of bees on 2.5 acres. Now they had more than one of these. I think they had 4 sets of 4 colonies on 2.5 acres. But for the purposes of discussion, 4 colonies of bees, 2.5 acres. I use the analogy of a noxious weed that would affect your cattle if you were a rancher. So you plant 2.5 acres with this noxious weed.
Yeah, like water hemlock or something?
Well, could be anything. Could be loco weed.
Okay.
Plant 2.5 acres, put 4 cows on that 2.5 acres, But don't fence that 2.5 acres. Those cows are free to roam over thousands of acres. What do you think the results are going to be? Well, they were exactly what Bayer wanted them to be. They left these bees on these test plots for 30 days, took their samples, and concluded that there was no problem. Well, a colony of bees will forage out for a mile and a half, over several thousand acres, so the 2.5 acres really were of no significance whatsoever. Well, now we move forward to November of last year. And I got a call before Thanksgiving from a person at EPA headquarters who said, Tom, you should be the first to know that Bayer came back to the EPA and wanted approval for clothianidin as a seed treatment on mustard and cotton. And because of the article that you wrote, the EPA scientists went back and reviewed the original life cycle study and have concluded that it's invalid.
Wow. Huh.
So now we have a product that's been on the market for 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's clear if you go through those memos that I've talked about that the life cycle study was the contingency upon which conditional registration was allowed, the completion of which cleared the way for full registration. We now have a product that has failed to meet the requirements of registration.
Yeah.
The EPA chose to simply ignore that to try to dismiss the importance of this life cycle study. But if you go back through the memos, and anybody can do that, we have them on the Boulder County Beekeepers website. People don't have to rely on my judgment. They can look for themselves. At the time it was occurring, this was the critical study. This was the contingency upon which conditional registration was granted, the completion of which cleared the way for full registration. Now I have a product that has failed to meet the requirements of registration, and the EPA chooses to ignore the law.
It sounds to me like something like the history of how the toxic chemical aspartame got approved to be in diet sodas, frankly, and knowing something about that.
Well, I'm focusing on clothianidin because this is the one that's having the most direct effect for me right now, but this is just representative of the way many of these have been handled.
Well, you say that this stuff becomes systemic to the plant. Can you describe that process? And also, is that different from most pesticides? Because I did see a commercial, a Bayer commercial for this in the last 2 weeks. I would not have known what it was if it wasn't from hearing about this from you. But, of course, the commercial was a slick marketing campaign, but it gave me the creeps knowing what this is doing now.
Well, we've gone through several generations of pesticides, and most of these are spin-off products from war technology. So at the end of the Second World War, we had all these chemicals, and they were looking for a way to utilize them, and, well, they'll kill bugs. Let's use them in agriculture. The first was DDT, and DDT was of a class that was relatively benign, not acutely toxic, but it stayed around forever and it got into everything and caused huge problems, and ultimately was banned.
Uh-huh.
The next generation of pesticides largely came from World War II nerve gas technology, and they were very, very acutely toxic, but they didn't last long. They were sprayed on the fields, and within a matter of hours, or at the most 2 or 3 days, they had dissipated, and theoretically at least broken down into products that weren't harmful. So their toxicity was short-lived, very highly toxic, but short-lived. And those were products that were sprayed on the fields, generally.
Uh-huh.
The systemic pesticides have come into use in the last 15 years, and in part because of GMOs. The first genetically modified corn was BT corn. BT corn had the Bacillus thuringiensis gene engineered into it. And what they found was that the corn plants had low seedling vigor. The answer to that was to use these neonicotinoids as a seed coating to protect that plant not only as a seedling, but further on into its life. And, of course, we were assured that once the plant matured, there wouldn't be enough clothianidin in the system to make any difference. But what we found is that very, very tiny amounts can have very profound effects. Here you have a product that's water-soluble. That's why it becomes systemic in the plant. The plant's vascular system picks it up, carries it to all the plant parts. It becomes part and parcel of the plant. But because it's water-soluble, it's also very mobile in groundwater. Its effect is it can accumulate in the environment from successive uses, which is exactly what's done in the Corn Belt. It can have a half-life of up to 19 years in heavy soils, which means that if you extrapolate that, it will take that soil a little over a century to purge itself of that poison. It has a devastating effect on soil organisms and earthworms and such. So in effect is sterilizing the soil over the long term.
Tom, on that commercial I saw, that television commercial, it showed a computer graphics program with arrows going up showing how this pesticide permeated up through the stem and into the leaves and into the flower. And that was supposed to, of course, be a good thing in the commercial. Wow.
We've begun to talk about the windshield test. A friend of mine first introduced me to this interesting little measure. He's a commercial beekeeper, and we often talk when he's traveling, moving bees or going from one place to another. And he was traveling through the Wisconsin River Valley, and he called and he said, "Tom, in years past when I would travel through here, I might have to stop twice to clean my windshield because of all the bugs." He said, "There just aren't any bugs." He said, "When was the last time you cleaned your windshield?" And that's a test that anybody can use. I can remember as a youngster, we had these bug shields on the front of the vehicles, so that the bugs would go up over and you were always cleaning the bugs off of your windshield.
That is very ominous.
So we may have done just much too good a job, and the bees are really the miner's canary. They're really the indicator species here. Critical, very important. There's strong suspicion that these neonicotinoids, these systemic pesticides, may be involved in the decline in the bats that we're seeing.
In bats too?
Well, bats are insect eaters.
Yes.
One of the things that these neonicotinoids do is they compromise the immune system of the insect. It's been compared to AIDS. People don't die of AIDS. They die of all those other things that a compromised immune system makes them vulnerable to. And insects are no different. For several years now, every article that you've seen in the major media has tried to spin this away from pesticides. We've been told that it was the varroa mite. It's viruses. It's funguses. It's anything imaginable that they could come up with. It's cell phones,
Phony disorder.
And the interesting thing is that all these excuses that they've been trying to use fit very nicely under the rubric of neonicotinoids because they can have both a direct lethal effect and an indirect and long-term effect because they compromise the immune system and they make them vulnerable to the exact things that have been used as excuses. These aren't excuses or alternative explanations. These are a consequence of the pesticide. These are symptoms.
Yes. I can tell you, Tom, I drive up and down I-5 in California about twice a year, and that's they call it the salad bowl of the nation.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, there's no more bugs.
So here we are today. Clothianidin is still on the market. The lead researcher for the USDA 2 years ago conducted a study where test colonies were fed very tiny amounts of a neonicotinoid, and then were challenged with Nosema cerana. Nosema cerana is an intestinal disorder, and is one of those things that has been used to excuse away CCD. All right? So they fed them tiny amounts of the neonicotinoid. Then they challenged these test colonies with Nosema cerana, and what they found was that those test colonies were susceptible to the Nosema. This falls in line with this compromising of the immune system. Even more interesting, what they found was that in the larva, that's the stage that's affected, they could not find the neonicotinoid in the larva. It was below their ability to detect it. It was below the level of detection. And that gets back to what I said earlier. Tiny, tiny amounts can have profound effects. Now, this work hasn't been published for 2 years. And many questions arose as to why it was taking so long for it to be published, and still hasn't been published. But about a month and a half ago, a presentation was engineered by the chemical industry over in Europe for the lead researcher, Jeff Pettis, to go and speak before Parliament. And among other things, what he said was, we can't draw conclusions from laboratory studies.
Oh, really?
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's the first thing. Now, the second little piece of that, orchestrated by the chemical industry, has to do with a gentleman by the name of Tom Moriarty. He is the leader of the EPA's B team. This is the group that's supposed to be focusing on all of these problems. And he has recently said at a meeting of APCO, which is the American Association of Pest Control Officers, largely populated by the state regulatory people, and what he has told them is, we have no evidence that clothianidin is involved with these bee declines. And he said, we can't do field studies because we have to have control of a 10-mile radius. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I don't know where he's coming up with this stuff, but that's what he's telling these regulatory people. So here we have the bookends orchestrated by the chemical industry. You have the lead researcher who says you can't draw any conclusions from lab studies, and you have the leader of the B team for the EPA saying we can't do field studies, and yet that same kind of science, or no science at all, is acceptable to get these products on the market. Apparently it takes an act of God to get them off the market.
Yeah. Well, Tom, wouldn't old-fashioned, tried-and-true, traditional crop rotations preclude the need for all of these pesticides? Or
well, it certainly would reduce it, and that's one of the things that farmers have done for generations, and that's to rotate the crops and stay ahead of the insects. But what industrial agriculture wants to do is to turn America into a corn factory, where you can just grow corn on corn on corn on corn. And of course, when you do that, you ring the dinner bell for all sorts of insects that feast upon the corn. So rather than rotate, they want to pour these chemicals on the problem.
Yeah. So it's about profit.
Well, yes. And the farmers are as much victims here as we are. And
yeah.
What's a farmer to do? If you were a corn farmer and you wanted to grow untreated seed, you wouldn't be able to find untreated seed. You would probably have to special order it, and it might be a year or two before you could get it. And one of the reasons is that the chemical industry has taken over the seed business.
Wow, yeah.
These are the robber barons of old,
That's
the
right.
modern version.
I don't know if you're familiar, Tom, with the Bayer Corporation's history, going back to I.G. Farben. I know you're familiar with the corporate mindset coming out of IBM many years ago. I heard you talk about that.
Yes.
Yeah, it's profit.
They don't have a very good history.
Yeah. Well, the big, I guess, another big question. Are you aware how much Bayer Corporation has made off of this pesticide?
Last year, I believe the figure on clothianidin was $262 million. Wow. And collectively, the neonicotinoids are well over $1 billion a year.
Do you know, something crazy that I was reading online in several places? There are apparently a number of pretty large beekeeping associations that support this and support Bayer and support clothianidin. Is that right?
It's an interesting division within the beekeeping community, because there are beekeepers who think that the appearance of the systemics has been a step forward, because in the past they would get direct kill from those products that I talked about earlier that are sprayed on the corn. What they don't understand is what's really going on here. If you look at the commercial beekeeping industry, they're losing between 50 and 60% of their colonies every year. What's generally reported in the media is 30 to 32%. Those are the winter losses. That overlooks the losses that occur during the balance of the year. And if you talk to most of these commercial operators, and they're forthcoming, the real losses are between 50 and 60% a year. They're reluctant to say that because they feel it's a reflection on them, they believe, that they can't keep their bees alive. And the fact is they can't keep their bees alive, and I don't think any industry can last for long if you lose 50 to 60% of your base every year.
So the future of beekeeping is in jeopardy.
The future of the food system is in jeopardy, because that pollination connection is critical to about a third of American agriculture.
So this is that portentous.
Of course.
Yeah.
I've always used the analogy of the oil in an engine. You may have a $50,000 vehicle with $20 worth of oil in it. But without that oil, that vehicle is not of much value. Honeybees, by way of the pollination connection, are the oil in the engine of agriculture. But this goes far beyond the bees. These environmental disruptions go far beyond the bees. A good example is what's going on over in Europe, in Holland particularly, where they have documented the levels of imidacloprid, the first neonicotinoid, used extensively in the bulb culture. They've documented it as high as 4,000 times the legal limit in the groundwater.
Ooh.
And they believe that it's having dramatic effects on the insect-eating bird populations over there, some of which are approaching extinction. We have documented in this country the steep decline of 4 major bumblebee species, and the likelihood is that we're seeing similar declines in other native bees and bumblebees. We just haven't monitored it.
Perhaps some butterflies that would drink the pollen too.
Well, certainly, yes. There's a process called guttation it's like the corn can sweat overnight. It exudes little water droplets. And in an arid climate, the insects, particularly the honeybees, will exploit that source of moisture. That guttation droplet is contaminated with the neonicotinoid. The groundwater can have the same effect on many insects who have access to the water.
Now, if you said this before, forgive me, but is this process irreversible?
Well, Henk Tennekes, who's a toxicologist in Holland, believes that the effect, it's a nerve toxin, all right? He believes that the effect on the synapses is cumulative and irreversible, so that small exposures over time can have the same effect as a large exposure all at once. Now, there's some controversy as to its cumulativeness and irreversibility. It may not be absolute. Tennekes believes that it is. Regardless, it's very devastating.
Now, you mentioned corn. The other, I think there's 4 big crops. Wheat and soy and probably canola.
I don't know about wheat, but it's used on corn, canola, soybeans, sunflowers, sugar beets. There may be a couple of others in there, but those are the major ones.
Well,
sunflowers are of great concern. In the West, sunflower culture is growing. It's a good crop in the West, and what studies have shown is that the levels of neonicotinoids peak in the flower head. What the plant does is it draws those resources to the flower head, among which are the systemic insecticides, so that the level of the neonicotinoid peaks in the flower head. And sunflowers are attractive to all manner of nectar and pollen-feeding insects.
Well, those big crops that I mentioned, though, it's interesting, and I know that I think that the barefoot beekeeper guy, I think his name was Phil Chandler.
Yes.
Yeah, he was very knowledgeable. He's a beekeeper himself out of Britain, and again, that's the Barefoot Beekeeper. If anybody wants to look that up, you had you had a fantastic interview over there. But I know Phil mentioned that the big crops, the big monoculture crops, if you notice, those are not crops that require bees to be pollinated. How convenient for the corporations.
Right. Yes. This is a global issue, and anywhere that we have industrial agriculture, we've seen these steep declines, these huge losses. It's global in nature. It's not restricted to the United States.
And you say this has been going on 8 years?
Well, clothianidin has been on the market since 2003.
Yeah. It sounds also dire. Is there anything people can do about this?
That's a good question because, unfortunately, I want to speak on behalf of the EPA employees first off. I think most EPA employees want to do the right job. I think what we have here is an enormous management failure in the EPA. I think that they're working at the behest of the chemical industry. They're not carrying out their responsibilities to protect man and the environment from these unreasonable risks. And the corporations are in control. The corporations are in control not only of the regulatory system, these mega corporations are in control of the legislative system, the judicial system. They have a heavy hand in research, which is why it's been difficult to find research which shows us what's really going on, because the researchers are reluctant to step into this because it's not a good career choice.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So they tend to shy away from it. The large corporations are in control of everything. And I've said a number of times over the past year, there's a new word that's come into my vocabulary, and that word is corporatism.
Mm-hmm.
Corporatism, as I understand it, is the flip side of fascism. Fascism is the takeover of industry by government. Mm-hmm. Corporatism is the takeover of government by industry. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're seeing. And that's really the root cause here, the root problem, is this total control of everything by these large corporations. And until we break the death grip they have on everything, I'm afraid there are dark days ahead. Now, you ask what people can do. I think what they can do at this point is to educate themselves, just as you have and just as you're trying to do with this interview, educate themselves as to the nature of the problem so that as we stand up and fight against this, we have an educated public that can stand up with us. Because as beekeepers, we have no power here. We don't have the power of numbers. We don't have the money. We don't have the clout. The only power we have is the power of public opinion.
Yeah.
And we need the public to stand up with us. Now, I would suggest that, among other things, they go to one of three websites. The first would be BoulderCountyBeekeepers.org.
I'm looking at it, yeah.
And we've tried to put as much of the pertinent information on there as possible. You can find the leaked memo that has been so controversial. You can find all the EPA memos. You can find some of the articles that have been written. Two other websites would be the Pesticide Action Network, PANNA, P-A-N-N-A, or Beyond Pesticides.
Can you give us that website again, too?
Yeah, PANNA, P-A-N-N-A. It's the Pesticide Action Network North America.
Got it. And also, we're looking at the BoulderCountyBeekeepers.org, and you have your own page on there, right?
I do. They gave me Tom's Corner, is what they're calling it. And the third one would be Beyond Pesticides. Their website has much of this information. What happened as a result of the call that I got in November, I asked the person who was calling, I said, has this decision been documented? And they said, yes, it has. I said, could I get a copy? And it was sent to me. This is what has become the famous leaked memo.
Yeah.
In fact, what it is a public document. I had every right as a citizen to have it, but I'm sure the EPA was embarrassed and would rather it had not gotten out. But characterizing it as a leaked memo made it very interesting to everybody, and so the leaked memo is on the website. People can read the leaked memo, and what resulted from that was a national press release on the 8th of December and a letter that went to Lisa Jackson, the EPA administrator, calling for the removal of this product from the market. It took the EPA 10 weeks to respond to that letter. Now, when I was at IBM, the practice was that a business letter had to be responded to within 3 days. Mm-hmm. That was what we tried to adhere to. And the response to that, the letter is on the website. The response to the letter is on the website. It's all there. People can read it for themselves and draw their own conclusions. But what I was saying earlier is I think the greatest contribution they could make at this point is to use the brain power, take a little time, read through this information and understand what's going on here, because these people count on our ignorance.
Yes. A word on corporatism before we get out of here, Tom.
Yes.
I know you spent, 10 years at IBM?
10 years, yeah.
And I heard you say that gave you some insight into the corporate mind, and I think you even said you saw some kind of important decisions made.
Well, I had the unique opportunity as a young man to be in the smoke-filled rooms and be privy to very high-level decisions, and I just had a unique opportunity to see the operation of a corporation. So I understand how the corporate mind works, and I'm not opposed to corporations. I think the corporate model is a good one, and I think when it's properly managed and it focuses resources and intelligence on a problem, corporations can accomplish wonderful things. They're good at what they do, but if what they do is bad, they're good at that too.
Well, these people, who are sitting in the boardrooms making these decisions, if they kill the food supply, they're going to starve too. What is it that blinds them to that problem? It's something more than just profit, isn't it?
You need to talk to them, I guess.
Yeah, okay.
I have a compatriot in Scotland who believes that their overall aim here is to take control of the world food system.
So it's monopolyism.
If you have control of the food supply, the people will fall in line.
That's power. Yeah. Wow. Well, Tom, here I am thinking about getting into bees. I'll probably run into these problems, won't I?
You certainly will. Yeah, and it's interesting because if you read a lot of the stories that have been written, you'll find in some of them this suggestion that this really is a commercial beekeeper's problem. And in fact, it may be because of our practices that we're causing these problems. I don't think that's fair. But the sideline beekeepers and the hobbyist beekeepers think that they're somehow free of these dynamics, and they're not. And I've used the example of let's assume that you get a colony of bees next year, and you keep those bees alive for the first year and the second year, but they die the third year. And you replace them, and you keep them alive for a couple more years, then they die again. Well, as an individual beekeeper, the loss of one colony every third year doesn't seem to be too dramatic. It's certainly not as dramatic as a commercial operator who loses 1,000 or 2,000 colonies in a year, but statistically, it's about the same in terms of the loss as the rest of the beekeeping industry is experiencing. And imidacloprid, the first neonicotinoid, is now, I understand, the most widely used pesticide in the world. It's used extensively in urban settings for control of turf insects. It's injected into the soil and into trees. As I said, it's mobile in the groundwater, so it can be taken up by other plants, flowering trees, wildflowers, weeds that bees and other insects forage on. It has a contaminating effect over a large part of the environment. And if you live in town, if you live in the city, you're certainly not free of it.
No. As a final question, would you recommend that more people get into beekeeping as a hobby? Do you think that would help stem the tide, keep the bees alive as a species?
Well, it certainly isn't going to hurt to have more people. And yes, I do encourage people to get into beekeeping. Here in Boulder County, in my home region, the hobbyists have really kept the beekeeping and the pollination alive. Were it not for them, we would be just about out of bees.
Wow.
So yes, I think it's important for individual beekeepers to have a colony or two. It helps. You have to consider, if you have a colony of bees, your colony of bees is going to be pollinating everything within about a mile.
Yeah.
So the benefit of your bees extends far beyond your yard.
Yeah, far beyond your own garden.
Yeah.
Well, Tom, it was a pleasure talking to you. This was very informative and very important.
It is very important, and the bees really are the miner's canary, and as critical as they are an indicator species, and they show us that there are very serious problems going on here that we need to deal with. I'm afraid that the beekeeping industry will not be able to survive the environment that's been thrust upon us.
Well, thank you again, Tom, and I'll probably be able to get this show up before the end of the weekend, I'm hoping, and I'll send you the link.
Great.
I'll email you the link.
And if you have any other questions, Gordon, give me a call, and I'll try to answer them as best I can. You know, I didn't go looking for this fight.
Yeah.
I've been swept into the maelstrom. I'm doing the best I can.
Yeah.
But we really need the public to stand there with us.
And speaking of the public, if folks want to contact you, can they email you from your site, or?
Yeah, they can email me by way of the Boulder County Beekeepers or however. You know, I'm one man, and I was gone for a week in California bringing back a load of packages, and in the week that I was gone, when I came back, I had 112 emails, and
oh, wow.
I don't have any staff, I don't have any secretary, so I'm not overwhelmed, but I'm whelmed.
Yeah. Well, that's what it's like being a one-horse operation.
Yeah, so I'll do the best I can. I'll answer people's questions, but they need to understand that I'm just one person, and I can't, if I get deluged with questions, I probably won't be able to keep up.
Well, thank you again, Tom.
Gordon, I enjoyed talking to you, and as I said, if you have any other questions, give me a call.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I'm giving you a choice. Either put on these glasses or start eating that trash can.